Well, hello there again. It is time to keep on chugging along in our Women in Church Leadership videos. There's still plenty to go through. I believe this is the 7th video we are making, and this will be the 2nd video on 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15. So if you haven't watched the first one, I would encourage you to go back and watch that one first. Actually, it's just best in general to watch all these videos in order, but I also understand if you're really like, oh, I want to know about 1 Timothy 2, because that's kind of the sticking point. I get it, but you should definitely watch the first 1 Timothy 2 video before watching this one. And as I said in the last video, we're kind of taking a couple of detours. I talked about my basic understanding of 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15 in the last video, but now there are two topics that require more attention than some of the specific topics, a little bit more time to address, that are very significant. I would say they're not central to an egalitarian reading of 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15. In other words, either way you take these two topics, you can still easily come to an egalitarian interpretation. But I think both of these, when you look at them, they would bolster the claim for an egalitarian interpretation and help us to see and just kind of help clarify some of the lingering questions that we might have. So the first topic is today is about how to translate or interpret the phrase teach or exercise authority. 1 Timothy 2, Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man or a husband, again, depending on the way you understand that. We talked about that last time. But how do you translate or interpret the phrase teach or exercise authority? And really that debate is focused, although I'm going to broaden it a little bit, is focused on one Greek word, alphanteo, which is translated to exercise authority in many translations. Now, we're going to go in a little in depth here. So if you don't want to talk about grammar and translation philosophy and all that kind of stuff, don't want to talk about the Greek nerd stuff, you can skip this, that's fine, but let me explain why it's important before you do. This word only occurs one time in the entire New Testament, just in this one verse. And that already makes it tricky to translate, but there's also not even any related words in the alphanteo word group in the New Testament at all. And it's also just a fairly uncommon Greek word in general. It's a very rare, very uncommon word, period. So the translation of this word is very tricky. And over the last few decades, many Bible scholars have questioned the translation of this word. For a number of reasons, some scholars think the word has a negative connotation, preferring translations such as domineer, assume authority, usurp authority, or even abuse. And here's the catch. If alphanteo means something along the lines of domineer, this text could easily be read in such a way that would allow a woman to teach or exercise authority in the church context in a way that's not domineering. Actually, I think it would lend towards that interpretation. But yes, this is a detour. Like I said, this is not central to an egalitarian interpretation of 1 Timothy 2:12, but I think if this word should be translated as domineer or something like that, then it is much more difficult to hold on to a complementarian interpretation of this passage. All right, so here are I'm going to lay out the broad conversation. First, there is a verb. So the verb is alphanteo. There is a related word in classical Greek, alphantes, which is a noun. And classical Greek was the Greek really leading up to the time of the New Testament. And much earlier than that, Homer, all that kind of stuff was classical Greek. The Greek of the New Testament is different. It's Koine Greek. And so Koine Greek, it came out of classical Greek. That's its ancestor language, but it's almost like us going back and reading Beowulf, or maybe not Beowulf, that's very old, maybe more like Canterbury Tales or Shakespeare, somewhere in that general, there's just like a progression. It's all on a spectrum, that's language evolves over time, that's just the way it works. But in classical Greek, there was a noun, authentes, which meant murderer. That was like very clear, established word. And there are 3 references to this noun, authentest, meaning murderer, which are significant in my opinion. From the Wisdom of Solomon, from Philo, and from Josephus. Wisdom of Solomon is notable because Paul was almost certainly familiar with the book. It was written probably around 100 years before the time of Paul himself. And it was often bundled with the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So most first century Jews were familiar with the Wisdom of Solomon, and it was widely read. It may have even had a significant impact on Paul's own thought. Some scholars will argue that Paul was interacting with ideas from the Wisdom of Solomon in portions of the books of Romans and Ephesians. So Wisdom of Solomon, Paul was almost certainly familiar with. And that book uses the word authentes as murderer. Philo and Josephus are notable because, like Paul, they were Greek-speaking Jews who lived in the first century, meaning that their familiarity with the word may have had significant overlap with Paul's. And Philo is a particularly interesting example because he talks about Cain and Abel and refers to Cain as a murderer, an authentes. The interesting part is that he uses this as an allegory to combat false teaching. He says that the one who believes false teaching becomes an authentes of himself. And that connection provides a thematic link between Philo and Paul's first letter to Timothy. As we talked about last week, false teaching is a very prevalent theme in the book of 1 Timothy. Either way, this shows that there was a negative association with words related to the word authenteo, which is the word we're looking at today. The point is not to say that Paul meant murderer or murder in 1 Timothy 2:12 instead of exercise authority, but that related words carried that negative connotation. And if you know the way language evolves over time, often if a word comes out of a related word, it still carries some of that connotation of the original word carried. So that's just evidence to support this claim. But again, the difficulty with translating this word is that it is so uncommon in the New Testament and the Greek of the time period. Now, we could spend a lot of time looking at specific examples of the word authenteo in Greek of that time. And we could go through them all and say, look, here's this one. Is this a positive connotation? Is this negative? What's the best translation of this example? We're not going to do that today because all of the examples are from literature outside of the Bible. So to set up all of those examples would take a lot of time so you can understand the context of that and what's going on in that particular thing. It's just not worth it. That would be really getting down into the weeds. But here's what Tom Schreiner, complementarian scholar, says. He says this: in context, authentane can have a negative meaning. Authentane is the infinitive version of the verb authenteo. Just think of it as authenteo. That's simpler for our purposes. In context, it can have a negative meaning. We should not rule out the possibility that the context will incline us towards the meaning domineer or play the tyrant rather than exercise authority. And the point of that quote is this: scholars agree that there are both positive and negative examples of the word. That depending on the context, it could mean positive. I don't know if positive is the best word, but it could mean exercise authority in a positive or neutral sense, or it could mean domineer or play the tyrant, as Tom Schreiner just said. So the question becomes slightly complicated. What is the most common usage of the word? when different types of authors from different segments of society use the word, were they more likely? Like Paul is writing to a general audience, right? He's not writing to a sophisticated audience. So does that change the way the word is used? How does the context of the word change the nuance of the meaning, etc.? And scholars will argue back and forth on this position. There's lots of debates on this, and I found a lot of the conversation to be really two sides talking over one another's heads. They're not really making a bunch of headway. But a few years ago, a scholar named Cynthia Long Westfall came out with her own study of the word. And I found hers to be the most helpful. She uses complex linguistic categories such as transitivity, field, mode, and register. We're not going to use that kind of language here. I'm going to try and translate her findings into less technical language, but we are going to talk about grammar. So if grammar was never your strong suit, I apologize in advance. We're going to be talking about three different types of words: subjects, verbs, and objects. Subjects, verbs, and objects. And so you probably remember what a subject and verb is from early grammar. Most people can at least tell the difference between a subject and a verb. Think of the sentence, the boy threw. Boy is the subject, the noun, person, place, or thing that's doing something. And threw is the verb, the action. The boy threw. Boy is the subject, threw is the verb. Now, maybe you don't remember what an object of a sentence is. And the object is the noun receiving the action of the verb. So think about the sentence, a boy threw a ball. Remember, boy is the subject. What did the boy do? He threw. That's the verb. And the object is what receives the action of the verb. So the boy threw the ball. Ball is the object. So remember, the verb in question is authenteo. And in 1 Timothy 2:12, we have a subject, a woman, we have a verb, authenteo, and we have an object, a man. A woman is not supposed to authenteo a man. So, with that laid out, here are Westfall's findings. Basically, when the verb authenteo is used with a personal subject and a personal object, that means that the subject is a person and the object is a person. In other words, so like boy is a person, right? But ball is not a person. That's an impersonal object. So that would not be one of these sentences. But when the subject is a person and the object is a person, 100% of the time, except for if God is a subject, we'll talk about that. But basically, 100% of the time, subject person, object person, the word carries a negative connotation. It's a little more complicated than that, but basically, both the subject and object are people. This person authenticated that person. We could use the English word dominate or domineer in a similar sense. The Nazis dominated Western Europe. That's not good. The abusive husband domineered his wife. Not good. But if it's used in the context of a person authenteo-ing, an impersonal object, sometimes that's not a person. It often carries a positive or neutral connotation. I dominated that history test. The lady at that gym dominated the elliptical, right? Like, when you look at all the evidence the scholars argue over, this just clears up the confusion. When you simply map this grid onto the evidence, it seems to become pretty clear. People will argue about, well, what about this example or that example? But in all of the examples, this is the thing that clears it up. Is it two people or not? And as I said, sometimes God does dominate people in the writings of not the Bible, but people after the time of the Bible. But this is still not not a positive thing necessarily. It's in reference to God's judgment, His wrath, and so some writers will talk about God authenteo-ing Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, You don't want to be on the end of that. It's not a good thing. And it's also not the way church leaders or husbands and wives have authority. A husband should not authenteo his wife in that way, not the way God exercised judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. Same thing for church leaders. That's not the authority that church leaders are given. So here's Westphal in her own words. The recipients of this action of authenteo are abused and unloved, harmed, coerced, brutalized, destroyed, disrespected, dishonored, killed, and arrested. Also, besides passages that provide a direct commentary and repetition of the phrase in 1 Timothy 2:12, she's like, so unless they're like repeating exactly word for word that phrase, the closest parallel passage is in John Chrysostom's commentary on Colossians, where he commands husbands not to do this to their wives. So John Chrysostom was an early church father writing about 300 years, I believe, after the time of Paul. And he's a native Greek speaker. That was his native language, the same Greek, a couple hundred years removed, but it's still considered that Koine Greek. He was a native Greek speaker. He says this: husbands, do not authenteo your wives. Do not authenteo your wives. And you know what that tells us? That authenteo is not a neutral use of authority in that context. John Chrysostom believed that the husband was the leader of the household. He used that word ruler or leader in a positive sense. That's the husband's job in the household. So he's not saying husbands don't exercise authority over your wives. He's saying husbands don't domineer your wives. Don't authenteo your wives. Here's Westphal again. The prohibited action would share the range of harmful, unloving application of force or authority that should be characterized as forms of abuse, including domination or other emotional, mental, or physical abuse, which was legally sanctioned and widespread in practice in the Greco-Roman world, though not necessarily approved of in Greco-Roman household codes. This word could conceivably be translated as domineer or act like a tyrant, but given the range of action of the verb that emerged in the pattern and is better understood and translated more generally as abuse. And here's what she says. The most important conclusion of this paper is that when authenteo occurs with a personal actor or subject and a personal goal or object, a negative evaluation is given unless the actor has a divine authority. This appears to be because it has a destructive force when applied to a personal object. I'm saying personal. She says animate goal. I'm translating for us. A personal object. And it is an inappropriate action for those who do not have the authority of life and death. It's inappropriate for those who don't have the authority of life and death, which is everybody but God. There were no examples. Listen to this. There were no examples in the sample occurrences where a man did this to another person in a positive way in the register of church leadership. Now, that last sentence is important because later on in early church writings after the New Testament, this verb is used of what some church leaders do. Some people will say, like, look, the priests and the bishops and all these people were authenteo, and it was fine. There was no problem with it. And here's the problem with it. It's not a person doing it to another person. The verb is used to describe what church leaders do to issues and matters of doctrine. So if some dispute comes up, they authenteo the dispute. Or if there's a question of doctrine, like in Acts 15, when there's the question of circumcision and all in, they didn't authenteo the people there, they authenteo the dispute itself. And that's an important distinction. And when you see that distinction, what you see is, if it's a person authenteoing another person, it's always negative connotation, domineering, abuse, something along those lines. Another thing to consider before moving on, it's very instructive to look at how the earliest translations treated this word. The Bible was being translated into other languages when New Testament Greek was still a living language. So if you look at the Old Latin translation, one of the earliest translations of the New Testament, it translates this word here into the word dominari, which is where we get, you can guess, our English word dominate. And some will say, well, yeah, but dominari didn't really have the negative sense it does. I don't think you can do that, because in the Old Latin translation of 1 Peter 5:3, in that context, Peter is telling the elders how they're to take care of and shepherd over the flock. You can read it yourself. And he tells elders not to dominari the flock, not to dominari their congregation. This is something they're not to do. It's not a neutral exercise of authority. It's like a don't domineer, don't lord it over, don't be a tyrant. Depending on your English translation of 1 Peter 5:3, look it up. But the point is, there's a kind of caring and leading and all that that's appropriate for church leaders. This is not that. You could also look at the Syriac or Coptic or Arabic translations from very early on, first couple of centuries after the New Testament was written, when New Testament Greek was still a living language. So the people doing those translations had checks and balances from people who could speak Greek. If they themselves weren't those people, and the translation of the word carried a negative connotation. Another thing to consider is the words that Paul doesn't use here, because there are several Greek words which carry the basic meaning of exercising authority or ruling or leading. And I took New Testament Greek, I believe somewhere around 12 or 13 years ago. It's been a while. And honestly, my Greek is quite rusty. I can still read it, but I don't remember a lot of the vocabulary and all that kind of stuff. I have to use dictionaries and things like that and internet tools to help me remember all that word, because the vocabulary is just gone. And I do remember the Greek word exousia, which means authority, and the Greek word exousiazo, which means to exercise authority in the neutral sense. This is the Greek word that's it's common enough that I still remember it. That's the point. It's a very common word in the New Testament. It's the kind of word, I think this is when Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, all that kind of stuff. This is a super common word. And there's actually other words, I don't remember all of them, but there are other Greek words for authority or exercising authority that are less common than that one, but are still used relatively frequently in the New Testament. And these words for authority are used in the New Testament to talk about church leaders, to talk about God, to talk about other things like that. And they were common in the New Testament and common in the Greek of the day. But Paul doesn't use those words. If Paul is just talking about a normal use of authority or leadership or something like that, why didn't he use one of the many words he used that were normal and common? Why did he choose an uncommon word? And Paul was a good communicator, I think. He was skilled. And it made me think, well, why is he so skilled? Why is this unclear? I don't think it's unclear because it was unclear to Timothy. I think Timothy knew what was going on, but I'm not Timothy. So we have to do a little bit more work to try and understand what was going on. And here's the thing, Paul doesn't use those words, and the fact that he uses such a unique word should raise our eyebrows. And I don't think that has been adequately explained by complementarians. It does seem to me that Paul's saying something unique in 1 Timothy 2:12 that's distinct from the regular use of authority by leaders in the New Testament church, which would say to me, it's quite possible or likely that Paul is not forbidding women from the regular use of church authority, of the authority of church leaders. Okay, so before we move on from this, we said we're talking about the whole phrase, teacher exercise authority. We spent a lot of time on that one word, authenteo. But I think when we talk about teaching, we can start to see how that's related to the translation of the word authenteo, actually. And so maybe you say, okay, Joel, women shouldn't abuse men or perhaps their husbands. But what about teaching? Why aren't women allowed to teach men or their husbands? All right, so that's a great question. That just brings us down to one more layer of nuance in this whole discussion. And here's where I kind of think, use an argument from a complementarian scholar. Andreas Kostenberger has done an in-depth dive of the grammatical pattern of 1 Timothy 2:12 specifically the word translated nor, which is oude in Greek. 1 Timothy 2:12 would more literally be, I permit a woman neither to teach nor to exercise authority over a man. And what Kostenberger says is that when you see the word nor linking up two words like this, the words are either both positive or both negative in every example in the New Testament. And I looked into this and it seems to hold up. So what that would mean is that if in 1 Timothy 2:12 the word teach is positive, then the word exercise authority would be as well. And so Kostenberger kind of cuts through the whole other complicated discussion of the meaning of the word authenteo by arguing that teaching is almost always positive in the New Testament. So authenteo must be positive. In other words, Paul is forbidding women from doing something that would be positive in other contexts, so it must be because they are women. We don't have to ask the question, well, why is he forbidding them from teaching, exercising authority? It's because they were women, because this would be positive in any other context. Here's the problem. Kostenberger assumes that the word translated to teach in 1 Timothy 2:12 has a positive connotation because it often does in the Bible. And yeah, teaching does often have a positive connotation, but it doesn't always. Sometimes it has a neutral connotation, and sometimes it has a negative connotation. Take Revelation 2:20 as an example. But I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants astray, so that they commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. So that's clearly negative. Jezebel is teaching, leading people astray to commit sexual immorality. It's not a good thing. Teaching is not always a good thing. And this isn't a question of probability. Like, you can't say, well, okay, so when you count up all the occurrences of the word teach, let's just say, for an example, I didn't do this. Teach has a positive connotation 90% of the time, so it probably has a positive connotation here. It's not how this works. Let's say that 10% of the time it doesn't have a positive connotation. Like, the 90% doesn't erase the 10%. It's still negative or neutral 10% of the time. We have to look at the word in context to decide what Paul meant then. And in the context of 1 Timothy, what's one of the main themes of the book? False teaching. So yes, and even in 1 Timothy itself, there are words related to teaching, sometimes in reference to positive teaching. But also sometimes in reference to negative teaching, as when Paul refers to doctrines of demons in 1 Timothy 4:1. That's not a good thing. Like, this is hugely important and cannot be discounted. So you can't use Kostenberger's argument to sidestep the rather complicated discussion going on around authenteo. But here's where I want to take this conversation one step further. If Kostenberger's premise is correct, that the word nor links up words that are either both positive or both negative, then the reverse is true as well of what Kostenberger is saying, which means that if authenteo is negative, then teaching is negative too. What this shows us is that Paul often links up words to communicate one main idea, or has a one kind of general force behind what he's saying. So one of the debates I mentioned in the last video about this verse is whether to understand Paul is prohibiting one action or two actions. Is he saying a woman cannot teach, one, and cannot exercise authority, two, or is Paul just saying that a woman is prohibited from one thing, teaching in an authoritative fashion? Here's what Craig Blomberg says. Paul seems to have a propensity to use pairs of largely synonymous words to say just about everything important twice, or occasionally 4 times. Thus we find in verse 1, and this is of 1 Timothy 2, and this is just 1 Timothy 2. You could do this throughout all of Paul's writings, but just looking at 1 Timothy 2. Verse 1, petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving. 4 different things, one idea. Verse 2a, kings and all those in authority. Verse 2b, peaceful and quiet. Godliness and holiness in verse 3. good and acceptable in verse 4, to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth in verse 7a, a herald and an apostle in verse 7b, I am telling the truth, I am not lying in verse 8, without anger or disputing in verse 9, decency and propriety, and in verse 11, quietness and full submission. With this many examples of the pattern, we might well expect to find a similar pair in verse 12. And I should say, Craig Blomberg is a complementarian scholar. I try to quote them as much as I can to help you see that this is a complicated discussion. There's many sides of this conversation. So when you take all of those things into consideration, if Bible scholars like Cynthia Long Westfall are right about the translation of alphanteo, and if Paul is communicating one general idea rather than two, one possible translation of 1 Timothy 2:12 is this: I do not permit a woman to teach a man in a domineering fashion, or I do not permit a woman to teach her husband in a domineering fashion. Now, if that is the better translation, that is hugely significant. So in conclusion, on the first part of this video, on the question of how to translate teach or exercise authority, if 1 Timothy 2:12 is more accurately translated with some negative connotation like, I do not permit a woman to teach a man in a domineering fashion, then a very straightforward egalitarian case is almost inescapable. This would not be forbidding a woman from doing something a man can do. As I said, a man shouldn't domineer his wife, and a male church leader shouldn't domineer anyone in the congregation. And as I mentioned in the last video, it does seem quite possible that the false teaching was spreading particularly among the women. It's possible that Paul is here singling out women who are, in some way, influencing their husbands with this false teaching. And that's what he's singling out. Based on my reading of the evidence, I think that a very strong case can be made that the best translation of alphanteo contains a negative connotation in 1 Timothy 2:12. And so a word like domineer or abuse is better than a neutral term like exercise authority. I think that the evidence for that is stronger than the evidence for the translation to exercise authority. That said, I'm not a linguist. I'm not a Bible translator. I also don't think and that's just me reading all these different papers and studies and all that, arguing about this. That's my interpretation of it. But because there's relatively little evidence to go on, remember, this is a one-time word in the Bible and uncommon in Greek in general. There's not an abundance of evidence. It's not super obvious what's going on here. Because of that, because this is such a heated debate, and there's a lot of bias on both sides of this debate, I don't think it's responsible to declare with certainty that one translation is definitely better than the other. Here's the thing. There's not always enough evidence to know for sure how to translate a word in the best way. Most of the time, I think we can be pretty darn certain. Most of the time, as far as the Bible is concerned. Like I said, I don't want this to undermine your trust in the faithfulness and reliability of your English translations. They are very, very good as far as I'm concerned. Here is one of the handful of cases where there's a lot of debate and a lot of uncertainty. And with this question in particular, the debate over the best translation of this term has really only been going on for a couple of decades. There really wasn't much discussion. It was just, people just chose, this is the translation I think is best, until a couple of decades ago. In terms of biblical scholarship, that actually isn't very long. And it's been a very heated debate. While I think the question is closer to being solved today than it was a couple of decades ago, translation takes time to adjust to the most up-to-date scholarship. So I don't know if translations will begin to translate this verse any differently. I don't have my ears to the ground in terms of the Bible translation world. It's certainly possible, and there is some movement in that direction. The most recent revision of the New International Version, the NIV, probably the most popular version, or one of the most popular. The most recent revision in 2011 updated its translation to assume authority. So before it was exercise authority, and that's what many translations go with today, but they updated it to assume authority. One of the primary editors of the NIV, a complementarian scholar named Douglas Moo, claims that they chose this translation to be as neutral as possible so that it could be interpreted in either way. So you can kind of hear that, right? That assume authority could be, you could kind of find a complementarian or an egalitarian interpretation based on that translation. It could be a positive thing or it could be a negative thing. And don't think that we're changing the Bible or something, that I'm trying to do that. Bible translations are updated all the time based on the best scholarship or just a slightly different nuance of translation philosophy. Listen, I talked about this last time. Translation is not a perfect business. You can't find a one-to-one translation of anything, whether you're just talking about Spanish to English, like modern day languages, or ancient languages. And we're talking about a language that's 2,000 years old. This isn't a simple process. And listen, it's not trying to change the Bible. Even the King James Version, if you want to go for traditionalism, the King James Version translates 1 Timothy 2:12 with a negative connotation. Here's what it says in the best old King James: I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over man. Usurp authority. They saw it as negative. I don't know what changed between then and the 1800s and 1900s when more translations were being made. But here's the thing. While I lean toward a negative understanding of this passage to teach in a domineering fashion, I do think the Bible scholarship has more work to do to make it more certain. And that's okay. The disputed translation of this one verse, here's what it all comes down to. This one verse, the translation of it is disputed, and that makes a huge difference in the way you interpret this verse. In addition, you think about all the interpretive difficulties, the mountain of interpretive difficulties I laid out in the last video. It means that this verse is still very much up for debate in my mind. While I have my interpretation that I lean towards, the interpretation of it remains uncertain. And that means, as far as I'm concerned, that we need to interpret what is unclear in light of what is clear. And this verse is unclear. Okay, so here is our second detour. In this one, we're going to be talking about the worship of the Greek goddess Artemis at Ephesus and what that has to do with 1 Timothy 2. And again, I don't think this is central to the way I read 1 Timothy 2. You can make a case without it, but taking a look at the religious practices surrounding the goddess Artemis is helpful in understanding what was going on in Ephesus at the time. And since we don't have a lot of information in 1 Timothy itself about the false teaching and what was going on, this historical context might just help us. So who was Artemis and why was she such a big deal? Artemis was a Greek goddess, also known as Diana. She was known as the daughter of Zeus and Leto. Apollo was her twin brother. Artemis was hugely important at Ephesus. Ephesus was the place of her birth, and her temple was there. And there was a lot of pride in Artemis's temple. It was even one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So it's important to understand how big a deal Artemis was to the Ephesians. They held a parade twice a month in her honor. This is what historian Guy McLean Rogers says about the parade for Artemis. It contributed to the sense of social and historical identity in the complex and changing Roman world and taught the people to look to the birth, listen to that, that's going to be important, to the birth of the goddess Artemis at Ephesus for a theological sense of how Ephesians' social and historical identity was grounded in a sacred reality, which was impervious to all humanly wrought challenges. Okay, so this Guy McLean Rogers, he's a secular historian. He's just talking about Artemis. He's not even talking about 1 Timothy or the Bible or anything. He's just explaining how the Ephesians at Artemis honored and worshipped, the Ephesians at Ephesus, the Artemis worshippers at Ephesus honored and worshipped Artemis. And take note that Artemis, she was born in Ephesus, remember? And their religious festivals taught the Ephesians to look to the birth of Artemis as the foundation for their sense of sacred reality. So Artemis, and specifically her birth, was central to the way of life in Ephesus. They had a parade twice a month. So for our purposes, a couple of other things are important. In the myth of Artemis's birth, she was born before her twin brother. For this reason, one of her titles was Protos, that is, firstborn. After she was born, it took her mother 9 whole days to birth Apollo. Can you imagine 9 days? And maybe this is some speculation, but it's perhaps the fact that she witnessed the long birth of her brother that Artemis became widely known, specifically at Ephesus, as the midwife goddess. She was known as a midwife. That was one of her primary roles in Ephesus. Many Ephesian women prayed to Artemis when they were giving birth for health and safety. Here's what Strabo, a first century Greek philosopher, said this: Artemis has her name from the fact that she makes people Artemeus, which means safe and sound. So the etymology of that is actually up for debate for scholars, but that's what people in the first century thought. They thought that she even got her name from the fact that she helps make people safe and sound. And it may be difficult for us to understand how important this role of Artemis was of protecting women during childbirth. With modern medicine, women survive childbirth most of the time. In ancient times, many women died during childbirth. And for this reason, women often died young and probably had a lot more anxiety surrounding their health during childbirth than modern women do. Here's the other catch. Women didn't only pray to Artemis for safety in childbearing. As a part of their Artemis worship, they performed magic in order to be safe during childbearing. Another important aspect of Artemis worship for our purposes is her virginity. Artemis was a virgin. She never married. There were many followers of Artemis in Ephesus, and many of them were married. But it's important to note that all records of Artemis's female priests were virgins as well. So some people say there's only female priests of Artemis. That's not true. There's a lot of misinformation going on. There were both male and female priests on record of Artemis in Ephesus in the first century. That's definitely true. We don't know about the male priests, whether they're virgins or not, but the only female priests that we know of whether they were virgins or married, they were virgins. And that's quite possibly because Artemis herself was a virgin. So why do I think Artemis is in the background here? So like you might say, she's never mentioned by name in the book of 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy or even Ephesians. But it's not surprising that Paul doesn't name Artemis. Most Jews of the first century did not ever use the names of pagan deities. Paul had been a practicing Pharisee his whole life and probably saw no reason to stop that custom. But Paul is not the only author of Scripture who refers to Paul, Timothy, and their time at Ephesus. Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, was a Gentile, most likely. And if he wasn't a Gentile, he was influenced by Greek culture very much, so he spoke more like a Greek or a Gentile. But Luke, he wrote the book of Acts, and he tells us about their time at Ephesus in Acts 19 through 20. And he is also not afraid to use the name of specific Greek gods. So he talks about Zeus, and he talks about Artemis, and we don't see Paul ever specifically name any Greek god. And it's not because there weren't Greek gods around, but he just isn't going to do that as a Jewish individual. So I would encourage you to go read Acts 19 and 20 yourself to kind of get some of the flair for what was going on at Ephesus, because that sets the stage for 1 Timothy. And Acts 19 has some of my favorite passages in the book. There's a lot of spiritual things happening at Ephesus, miracles, demons being cast out, books of magic being burned. And notice it says that it's believers who had these books of magic. And so in response to what God was doing, they burned them. And so I think personally, this isn't super clear. Maybe they just kept their books of magic until they felt convicted enough about it. But very much in that time, it was common for people to try to mix their Christian faith with their old pagan faith. And so that's possibly what was going on. But listen to this. Because of the spread of the gospel in Ephesus, many new believers were destroying their idols, which in turn caused a riot among the silversmiths at Ephesus. The silversmiths were making idols, right? Little statues of gods. Now, the gospel was at work so powerfully that it caused an economic disturbance, and I love it. I would love for that to happen in our day, that merchants of some sort were mad because of how much the gospel had changed people's buying and spending habits. But okay, so at the riot, what is the reason given? Like, why are they rioting? In verse 27, it says that a silversmith named Demetrius addresses the crowd. And here's what he said in verse 27. Here is danger, not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. And the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. And then in the next verse, verse 28, this is the response. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So what does this tell us? Artemis is clearly in play hugely at Ephesus. Like Artemis of the Ephesians, like they lay claim to her. It is also important to note that the book of 1 Timothy has all of this in the background. Remember what Paul said to Timothy in his opening statements in the letter. 1 Timothy 1:3. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. So Paul and Timothy and their time at Ephesus and all that is documented in Acts 19 and 20. It's kind of hard to lay out an exact timeline of what was going on and what Paul's referring to here in 1 Timothy 1:3. But what is clear that when Paul and Timothy were in Ephesus together, all this stuff was going on with Artemis and with magic books being burned. And then Paul at some point leaves Timothy behind specifically to combat false teaching. So when you look at the biblical evidence itself without any reference to the historical evidence, it wouldn't be surprising that there may still be some Christians around who are trying to somehow intermingle their old pagan ways, in some way connected with the worship of Artemis, with their newfound faith. But when you consider the historical context, it begins to all make sense. The false teaching at Ephesus involved forbidding marriage. Artemis was a virgin, and her female priests were virgins. The false teaching at Ephesus also involved magic practices, as did the worship of Artemis at Ephesus. And we see that both in Acts 19 and 1 Timothy 5, as we talked about in the last video. Paul said in 1 Timothy 2:15 that women would be saved through childbearing. And one of Artemis's primary activities in Ephesus was keeping women safe through childbearing. So this is where we tie it all together. I think Artemis helps us to explain two head-scratching aspects of 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15. The first one is in verse 13. Paul says in verse 12, "I do not permit a woman to exercise or exercise authority over a man or a husband," or however you want to translate that. That's verse 12. And then after that, he says this, verse 13 and 14. "For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner." All right, so here's the deal. Most complementarians will say Paul is grounding his teaching in the creation order, which means this is a universal teaching. And I'm not convinced, as I talked about last time, that word "for" in verse 13, "for Adam was formed first." It could be reason. It could be read as giving the reason for the logical foundation for Paul's earlier statement. Like, here is the logical connection between them. But it could also be read as introducing an example. The word "for" is used, or the Greek word used there is used that way throughout the New Testament. So it's possible that Paul is introducing the teaching to correct the false teaching that was spreading. And remember, it's quite possible, we talked about this last time, and we're seeing the dots connected even more this time, based on a straightforward reading of 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, that the false teaching was spreading in homes among women. It's also quite reasonable to connect this false teaching to Artemis. Remember that in the Artemis story, Artemis was born first. And even one of her main titles was Protos, firstborn. And remember that secular historian guy who said that they looked to what? The birth of Artemis for their understanding of sacred reality. So this was the birth of Artemis was super important to them. So what if that's part of the myth that Paul is talking about in 1 Timothy that's spreading. This false teaching has to do with the birth of Artemis and her being the firstborn. And what if Paul is correcting that false teaching with the biblical creation count, saying in your creation where you find sacred reality, you think the woman came first. But in truth, it is the man who came first. So that's what I think what's going on there is that Paul is introducing the correct teaching to counter the false teaching that is spreading, or one aspect of the false teaching that is spreading. So then that brings us to the second part of that, where in verse 14 it says, Adam was not deceived, it was the woman who was deceived and became a transgressor. And I referred to this last time. It's not clear to me that Eve's deception means something for women that it doesn't necessarily mean for men. And this is important because apparently this is the logical connection, right? Between verse 12, Paul's prohibition of women, and verse 14, that because Eve was deceived and not Adam, then now all women everywhere should not teach men or exercise authority over men. That this is a universal, this is what complementarians will claim. I don't think that holds up. And I said this last time. 2 Corinthians 11:3 says this, I'm afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So there in 1 Corinthians 11, we see Paul referring to Eve as an example. This isn't some universal thing like all women are more prone to deception than men, or for whatever reason, because Eve was deceived, now women can't teach, which is also just like a strange thing. Like, okay, so a woman was deceived, but but the man chose to sin deliberately, apparently. So now women can teach or can't teach, but men who sin deliberately can. Just the logic is difficult to follow there. But what that means is here in verse 14, it doesn't seem that Paul is using Eve as an example to ground some universal reality that all women are prone to deception or something along those lines. And if that's the case, if Paul isn't appealing to some universal reality that has some eternal relevance that goes back to Genesis, instead it's just a picture, an example of like, hey, look, just in the same way that the woman was deceived then, now women are being deceived. It's just an example. Like, this is a similar thing. He's making a connection. But that doesn't mean there's a one-to-one correspondence that means we should have a universal prohibition or something like that. I don't think you can do that because of 2 Corinthians 11, because Paul uses Eve as an example there for both men and women, not just women. But what that means is if you can't use Eve in that way in the second half in verse 14, then why are you using Adam being formed first in that way in verse 13 as some universal principle? It just doesn't follow. Okay, now I'm getting off, going back to Artemis for a second here. That, to me, that helps us clear up verses 13 and 14, that there's some false teaching that Paul is correcting. Now, what about the other head-scratching aspect of this passage, which we haven't talked about a whole lot yet? Verse 15 says that a woman will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. And for a long time, many have had difficulty with this statement. Women will be saved through childbearing? What? We're saved by grace through faith, and Paul of all people is most passionate to defend that. Here's what many might not realize. The Greek word translated save can also mean heal. Actually, when Jesus and the apostles heal others, it's most often described with that word, which is translated as saved. We're talking about our universal salvation, that kind of stuff. But it doesn't always refer to that. Sometimes it refers to physical healing. So what if Paul is saying that they will be kept safe or healthy during childbirth? It certainly makes a lot more sense with Paul's overall theology and the historical context of what was going on at Ephesus. Remember, women prayed to Artemis to keep them safe during childbirth, and they even used magic to do so. And remember, Paul was talking against magic. We talked about this last time, all that. Paul is saying you don't need to go to Artemis. Some might say, but Joel, not all women survive childbirth. How can Paul make that promise? Fair response, but the Bible sometimes makes very bold promises. Just look at John 14:13 through 14, the promise of answered prayers, which sounds like every single time we should always have our prayers answered in exactly the way we want. That's what you think when you read that, perhaps. Or consider, for the case of healing, more specifically, what James says in James 5:14 through 15. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. These sure sound like promises. This will happen. Ask Jesus for anything and he will do it. Pray for the sick person and the sick person will get well. But we know this doesn't always happen. I have seen God work miraculous healings and I still hope and pray for that. But I also recognize that there are reasons that God doesn't heal every single time. Whatever explanation you have for those passages likely would also apply to 1 Timothy 2:15. If we assume that a woman will be kept healthy or safe during childbirth, if that's what it means. So it's time to wrap up this detour. I hope you see the importance of it. I do want to talk about what this is good for and what it's not good for. Understanding the historical context of the worship of Artemis at Ephesus does not control or dictate our understanding of 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15. The truth of the matter is that there's a lot going on behind the text that we just don't know. Paul doesn't neatly lay out the nature of the false teaching. He doesn't have to because he and Timothy know each other well. There's a lot unsaid between them. The reason I wanted to address this is partly because it does help provide a plausible explanation of what's going on. I also want to say, because there's a lot floating out there about Artemis. You will hear some say that Artemis was a sex goddess and her female priests were engaged in temple prostitution, and that's what Paul was teaching against. But that's simply not true. The historical evidence clearly shows that she was a virgin, and all of her female priests were virgins, and there was no evidence of sexual activity as a part of Artemis worship. The problem is some complementarians will jump on that and rightly say that that's wrong. But then they'll say that Artemis has nothing to do with Ephesus or 1 Timothy. But just because someone's wrong about one thing doesn't mean they're wrong about everything they said. So while there is a lot of misinformation about Artemis and her worshipers, there is also enough historical evidence to understand a lot of what was going on at Ephesus in the first century. And when you take the historical evidence into consideration and compare it to what's going on in the book of Acts, in 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, I think you can make a plausible case that the worship of Artemis was related to a lot of the false teaching going on and the practice of magic and all that kind of stuff, the myths and genealogies, all that. And the historical context helps us to fill in some of the gaps and to better understand what was going on in the first century. And when we can do that, it can help us to understand some of the head-scratching aspects of 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15. I don't think this historical context about Artemis deals a death blow to complementarian claims, but it is convincing to me. It answers a lot of lingering questions and fits nicely with both the biblical text and the historical text. It's plausible. It makes sense. And I did just want to address something, and we're going to go on to one more battleground passage next time, but I do want to address, just for those of you who are thinking like, oh my gosh, Joel, this is so much. How could the average everyday reader of the Bible know this stuff? And that we just have to be okay saying they might not be able to. I think we have this idea that every part of Scripture should be clear to us. We've talked about this several times already, and the simple fact of the matter is that not every part of Scripture is clear to us. As I've said, Peter says that sometimes Paul is hard to understand. It's not always easy. I do believe that what is essential, what is necessary for life and for salvation is clear in Scripture. It is sufficient. That does not mean that everything is going to be clear. As I referred to last time, though, there was a time when slave owners in, I think the 1700s and 1800s, they were giving their slaves slave Bibles which had whole portions of the Bible just ripped out because they didn't want to see God setting free the slaves and things like that. They wanted to hold on to that. But what is so cool to me is to look at the Black American church today, that there is so much faithfulness there, that still, and I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, that African Americans are some of the most likely to be Christians in America. And if you look at specifically African American churches, like they're the ones who read their Bible the most. They're the ones who hold the most biblical beliefs about who Jesus is, about him actually being God and having faith in the power of God's move today and all that kind of stuff. I think it's a miracle what God has done with the African American church. Their faithfulness, even though they were introduced to God historically by their slave owners. Like, that's crazy. And so it just goes to show that God can still move, even though our Bible translations aren't perfect, and even though we're not going to understand everything that's going on in the Bible, God still moves. He's perfect. He's good. We are not. We're not going to understand everything this side of heaven, but we can do our best to try to understand the Bible better and better every single day. And that's just what we're trying to do with these videos, is we're trying to understand what the Bible teaches about women in church leadership and to be faithful to that. So I hope this was helpful for you and clarifying, and maybe you have more questions now. And so I'd love to talk to you about whatever questions you may have. That would be great. Please reach out at any time. Have a wonderful week.